Thomas Greer eased his long frame onto the rough-hewn bench, the weariness of 1,000 miles seeming to settle in his bones all at once. The air in the Stonecreek way station was thick with the smell of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the low, rumbling murmur of men who had spent too long in the saddle. He nodded to the man who slid over to make room, a gesture of silent understanding that passed between strangers in such places. He surveyed the room, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows that danced on the timber walls. Men hunched over plates, their faces grim or empty, shoveling food into their mouths with a grim determination that had little to do with enjoyment and everything to do with fuel. He flagged down the proprietor, a portly man named Albright, with a stained apron and an air of perpetual impatience. "Anything on offer tonight besides beans and chili?" Thomas asked, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. He kept his tone even, devoid of complaint. It was a simple inquiry, but one born of a deep-seated exhaustion with the monotonous fare of the trail. Albright grunted, wiping a greasy hand on his apron. "Stew. Take it or leave it." He moved on without waiting for an answer, already barking at another traveler about the cost of a bed for the night. Thomas considered his options. There were none. He was in Stonecreek, Colorado, for the winter, having pushed his luck with the weather as far as it would go. The first snows were already dusting the high peaks, a stark warning that the passes would soon be impassable. He had a lead on work at the Anchor Ranch nearby, a place to hole up and earn his keep until the spring thaw. For now, this way station was his only refuge from the biting wind that howled outside. Stew it was. A few minutes later, a bowl was placed before him. It was not slammed down with the usual carelessness, but set on the table with a quiet lack of fanfare. He glanced up, but saw only a fleeting glimpse of a brown wool skirt disappearing back toward the shadows of the kitchen doorway. He had not seen a woman in the common room. He had assumed Albright, or some hired boy, did the cooking. He looked down at the bowl. The steam rising from it carried a scent that cut through the stale air of the room. It was not the familiar, often rancid smell of trail stew, thin and greasy. This smelled of thyme and bay leaf, of beef slow-cooked until it surrendered, of carrots and potatoes that held their shape but promised to melt on the tongue. It smelled, impossibly, like his mother's kitchen on a cold Sunday afternoon, a memory so distant it felt like it belonged to another man's life. He picked up the spoon, a heavy, battered piece of tin, and dipped it into the rich, dark broth. He brought it to his lips, expecting the usual disappointment, the gap between the promise of a smell and the reality of the taste. But the flavor that met his tongue was deep and complex, a warmth that spread through his chest and seemed to push back against the bone-deep cold. It was seasoned with a patient hand. It was the taste of home, a concept he had not allowed himself to dwell on for nearly a decade. He ate the first few spoonfuls slowly, then with a growing urgency, not of hunger, but of a desperate need to hold on to the sensation. It was more than food. It was a kindness. In a world that was hard and unforgiving, this bowl of stew was a small, profound act of grace. The other men at the table ate with their usual brutish haste, oblivious. To them, it was just food, a slightly better version of the usual slop. They would not notice the care that had gone into it. They would not understand what it meant. Thomas finished the last of it, scraping the bottom of the bowl with his spoon. He set it down and looked toward the kitchen. The noise in the room, the clatter of forks and the low drone of conversation suddenly seemed intrusive, profane. He needed to know. He pushed his bench back, the legs scraping loudly on the wooden floor. He stood, his height drawing a few curious glances. "Who made this stew?" he asked. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that cut through the din. The room fell silent. Men looked up from their plates, their expressions ranging from surprise to annoyance at the interruption. Albright, who was counting coins at a makeshift counter, turned with a scowl. "What's that?" the proprietor demanded. Something wrong with it? Thomas's eyes were not on Albright. They were fixed on the kitchen doorway. In the flickering, uncertain light, he saw her. A woman, younger than he had first guessed, perhaps 25. She stood frozen by the massive cast-iron stove, a dishcloth clutched in one hand. Her shoulders were rigid, her back ramrod straight, a posture of someone bracing for a blow. He saw the tension in the line of her jaw, the way her eyes were wide and fixed on him, filled not with curiosity, but with a weary, practiced dread. She was expecting a complaint, a criticism, a demand. In that moment, he saw her, not as a shadow or a fleeting skirt, but as a person. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the faint dusting of flour on her cheek, the quiet strength that held her upright when everything in her posture screamed of the desire to shrink away. She was the source of the impossible kindness in his bowl. And she was preparing for punishment because of it. He softened his voice, directing his words only to her, a private conversation in a suddenly public space. "It's the finest thing I have eaten in 10 years, he said, plainly and without embellishment. It was the simple truth. A flicker of something disbelief, confusion, perhaps even relief passed across her face before she could mask it. Her shoulders lost a fraction of their tension. She gave a short, jerky nod, a gesture so small it was almost imperceptible, then turned and vanished back into the depths of the kitchen, leaving him standing in the silence of the room. He sat back down. The other men, their curiosity sated, returned to their meals, the brief spell broken. But for Thomas, something had shifted. The world had tilted on its axis. He was no longer just passing through Stonecreek. He had a reason to stay. He got the job at the Anchor Ranch the next morning. It was hard work, mending fences and tending to the wintering herd, but it was honest work, and the foreman, a man named Peters, was fair. The arrangement allowed him to take his evening meals at the way station, a detail he had insisted upon, much to Peters's confusion. So began his quiet ritual. Every evening, as dusk settled over the valley and painted the snow-capped peaks in hues of purple and rose, he would ride the 2 miles from the ranch to the station. He would enter the common room, nod to the familiar faces, and take a seat at the same table. And every evening a bowl would be set before him. Sometimes it was stew, sometimes a thick slice of roasted meat with potatoes, sometimes a hearty chowder. It was always good, always prepared with that same quiet care he had tasted on the first night. He never saw her place it down. He would look up, and it would simply be there, a silent offering. He learned her name was Nora Bellweather. He heard it from one of the other hands, who mentioned she had been running the kitchen for 4 years, ever since her parents, who had owned the station, had been taken by a fever that swept through the valley. She had been alone ever since, a solitary figure working from before dawn until long after the last traveler had stumbled off to bed. She was a ghost in her own home. She moved through the spaces of the way station with a practiced invisibility, her steps light, her presence unassuming. She never sat in the common room. She never ate with the others. She existed in the periphery, in the steam of the kitchen and the clatter of pots and pans, a constant but overlooked presence. Thomas watched her. He watched from a distance, respecting the boundary she so clearly drew around herself. He noticed things the other men did not. He saw the way she favored her left wrist, as if it pined her. He saw the deep weariness that settled on her face late in the evening, when she thought no one was looking. He saw the small, almost invisible patches she had sewn onto the thinning elbows of her dress, a testament to her frugality and resilience. One evening he saw her struggle with the wood box just outside the kitchen door. The leather handle on one side had torn through, making it awkward and heavy to carry. She wrestled it inside, her face strained with effort. The next morning, before he rode out to the ranch, Thomas spent half an hour in the cold, crisp air with a piece of scrap harness leather and an awl from his saddlebag. He did not replace the handle. He mended it, stitching it carefully, reinforcing the worn spot until it was stronger than it had been before. It was a small, simple repair. He did it without a word and was gone before she emerged from the kitchen to start the day. That evening, his meal included a thick slice of apple cake, something not offered to anyone else. There was no note, no word of acknowledgement. There did not need to be. Another day, a sudden thaw followed by a hard freeze left the path from the kitchen door to the well house a treacherous sheet of ice. He watched from the common room window as she navigated it carefully, carrying 2 heavy buckets of water, her feet slipping precariously with each step. The following day, the path was clear, chipped and salted down to the frozen dirt. He had risen an hour before dawn, the sharp crack of his shovel against the ice the only sound in the sleeping world. He was not a man of many words. He did not know the language of flirtation or courtship. He knew the language of work, of practicality, of seeing a need and meeting it. He knew how to mend what was broken. He knew how to clear a path. This was the only way he knew how to speak to her, in a silent dialect of fixed handles and safe passage. And she, it seemed, understood him perfectly. His coffee was always a little hotter, his portion of stew a little more generous. These were their conversations, carried on across a crowded room in gestures of mutual, unspoken care, a quiet pact of acknowledgement in a world that rendered her invisible and him a transient. He started to feel a sense of ownership, not of her, but of her well-being. A protective instinct that coiled in his gut whenever Albright spoke to her with his usual dismissive tone. Thomas found himself lingering after his meal, nursing a last cup of coffee, just to be a silent presence in the room, a bulwark she may not have even known was there. The other hands at the anchor began to notice his routine. "Still riding into town every night, Greer?" Peters asked one afternoon, as they were checking a fence line. "Food at the bunkhouse not good enough for you?" There was a teasing edge to his voice, but Thomas answered plainly, "The food at the station is better." Peters grunted, hammering a loose staple back into a post. "Can't argue with that. Since the Bellweathers passed, that daughter of theirs has kept the place going. Quiet girl. Too quiet." He paused, glancing at Thomas. "Town looks out for her. In its own way." Thomas just nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant line of the mountains. He knew what Peters meant. The community offered a passive, distant protection. But no one was there in the late hours, when the last drunk had been sent to his room and she was left alone with the mountain of dirty dishes and the hollow silence of the house. He had thought he was just wintering in Stonecreek, a temporary stop on a long, aimless journey. But as the weeks wore on, the thought of leaving in the spring began to feel less like a certainty and more like a betrayal. The road going out into the dark beyond the town no longer looked like freedom. It looked like a loss. He was not a man given to introspection. He lived in the tangible world of leather and wood and weather. But he knew this. The thought of a meal not cooked by Nora Bellweather's hand was a bleak and tasteless prospect. He was not yet aware that he was falling in love. He only knew that he had found something he was unwilling to leave behind. The catalyst came on a bitter night in late January, when the wind rattled the windows of the way station and drove snow into stinging horizontal sheets. The common room was nearly empty, save for Thomas and a pair of fur trappers huddled by the fire. The scarcity of travelers had put Albright in a fouler mood than usual. Thomas was finishing his coffee when he heard Albright's voice, sharp and cutting, from the kitchen doorway. He was blocking the entrance, his bulk filling the frame, speaking to Nora, who was just out of sight. Thomas, sitting at his usual table, was in the perfect position to overhear every word. "Business is slow, Nora," Albright said, his voice a low, greasy whine. "Can't afford to keep paying you what I have been. I'm cutting your wages by 1/3, starting this week." There was a pause. Thomas could hear the soft scrape of a pot being scrubbed, a sound that did not stop. But you'll be taking on the morning laundry from now on as well, Albright continued, as if this were a perfectly reasonable addendum. No sense paying Martha when you're already here. It'll mean starting an hour earlier, but I'm sure you can manage. Thomas's hand tightened around his coffee cup. He did not move. He sat perfectly still, every muscle in his body tensing. He could not hear her reply, but he could imagine her silence. The quiet, stoic acceptance of yet another burden, another injustice. She would not argue. She would not fight. She would simply absorb it, as she had absorbed the loss of her family, her home, her visibility. "Good," Albright said, his tone one of finality. He turned from the doorway, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. He caught Thomas's eye, and his smirk faltered. Thomas's expression was unreadable, but something in the cold stillness of his gaze made Albright shift uncomfortably. The proprietor busied himself behind his counter, avoiding Thomas's eyes. Something inside Thomas Greer, something that had been slowly awakening all winter, finally hardened into a sharp, unyielding point. It was not just anger. It was a cold, clear certainty. He had watched from a distance for long enough. He had mended handles and cleared ice, small gestures on the periphery of her life. But this was not a problem that could be solved with a piece of leather or a shovel. This was a theft of her labor, of her dignity, and he would not stand by and watch it happen. He pushed his chair back, the sound loud in the quiet room. He stood and walked not to the main door to leave, but directly to the kitchen doorway. Albright watched him go, a nervous sweat beading on his forehead. He stopped on the threshold. Nora was at the large sink, her back to him. Her shoulders were slumped, the fight he had seen in her posture that first night now entirely gone, replaced by a profound and utter weariness. She did not turn. She likely thought it was Albright, returning with some new demand. He waited for her to finish scrubbing the pot she held. The sound of scouring steel on cast iron was the only sound between them. When she finally set it aside and reached for another, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Nora." She froze. She turned slowly, her face pale in the lamplight, her eyes wide and questioning. He had never spoken her name before. He had never stood in her doorway. He did not offer comfort. He did not offer sympathy. He did not offer romance. He offered her the only thing he knew how to give, a practical solution, an escape. "I have a piece of land," he said, his words measured and direct. He had purchased a small, neglected homestead adjacent to the Anchor property just last week, using the entirety of his savings. He had not known why, precisely, he was doing it. He knew now. It's not much, but it has a solid cabin and a good well. The ranch needs a cook for its own hands. A proper one. The pay is fair. The cabin comes with the work. He paused, letting his words settle in the space between them. He looked directly at her, his gaze unwavering. "No one will decide your worth for you again," he said. It was not a proposal of marriage. It was a proposal of independence, of respect. It was a promise that she would be seen, her work valued, her life her own. It was, in its own way, the most profound declaration of love he could have made. Nora stared at him, her expression unreadable. The dishcloth in her hand was twisted into a tight knot. He saw a dozen emotions pass through her eyes, fear, hope, disbelief, and finally, a glimmer of the same quiet certainty that he felt in his own chest. She had been waiting, not for a rescuer, but for a door. And he had just built one for her. She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. She simply untwisted the cloth, her fingers slowly uncurling. She laid it carefully on the edge of the sink. She looked around the kitchen, at the stove that had been her prison and her sanctuary, at the worn floorboards that held the ghosts of her parents. It was a look of farewell. Then she looked back at him. "When do I start?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but clear and steady. "Tomorrow," Thomas said. "I'll come for you at sunrise." She nodded once. A single, decisive gesture. He turned and left without another word, walking out of the way station and into the cold, clean fury of the winter night, the purpose in his stride as solid and real as the frozen ground beneath his feet. He had cleared a path for her. Now they would walk it together. She was ready at sunrise, as he knew she would be. He arrived with a small wagon borrowed from the anchor, the horse's breath pluming in the frigid air. The world was washed in the pale, ethereal light of a winter dawn. Nora stood on the porch of the way station, a solitary figure against the dark timber of the building. She wore the same plain brown coat he had seen her in before, a wool scarf wrapped around her head. Beside her on the porch sat a single small trunk, its leather straps cracked and worn with age. It was a meager collection of belongings for a lifetime lived in one place. Albright was nowhere to be seen. The way station was silent, as if holding its breath. Thomas swung down from the wagon and walked toward her. He did not offer to take the trunk immediately. He simply stood before her, waiting. "Is that everything?" he asked quietly. "Almost," she said. She turned and went back inside, leaving the door ajar. He waited, his hands in his pockets, the cold seeping into his bones. He was not impatient. He had a feeling that what she was retrieving was important. She emerged a moment later, her hands cradling a small, heavy object wrapped in a clean linen cloth. She held it carefully, protectively, as one might hold a sleeping child. "This," she said, her voice soft, "was my mother's." She unwrapped a corner of the cloth. Inside was a small stoneware crock, the color of rich cream, with a simple blue stripe painted around its middle. It was old, with a few fine cracks spiderwebbing its glaze, but it was solid and clean. "Her sourdough starter," Nora explained, her gaze fixed on the crock. "She brought it with her from Ohio. She said it was the one thing that made any place feel like home. It's all I have left of her." It was the most she had ever said to him at one time. In that simple statement, he heard the story of her loss, her loneliness, and her fierce, quiet preservation of memory. This was not just a crock of fermented flour and water. It was her history, her inheritance, the one thing in the world that was truly and completely hers. He nodded, his throat tight. "We'll find a good spot for it." He lifted her trunk into the back of the wagon as if it weighed nothing. Then he turned and held out a hand to help her up onto the seat. She hesitated for only a second before placing her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. He helped her up, and she settled herself on the hard wooden bench, holding the precious crock securely in her lap. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. He did not look back at the way station. He looked forward, down the snow-covered track that led away from the town and toward the small, neglected piece of land that was now theirs. The cabin was small, as he had said, but it was solid. The timbers were sound, the roof tight. Inside, it was cold and smelled of dust and disuse, but a fire in the hearth would soon chase that away. It consisted of one main room, with a small sleeping loft above. The stove was a sturdy, reliable-looking thing, and against the far wall stood a set of rough-hewn shelves. Thomas carried her trunk inside and set it by the wall. He turned to start a fire, but stopped. Nora had not moved from the center of the room. She was looking around, taking it all in, her expression a mixture of apprehension and a fragile, dawning hope. She walked over to the shelves, running a hand over the dusty wood. She turned to him, the crock still held tightly in her hands. "Here?" she asked, gesturing to a spot on the middle shelf, right next to the stove. It was a warm place, a safe place, the heart of the home. "That's a good spot," he said. She carefully unwrapped the crock completely, the linen cloth falling away. She reached up and placed it on the shelf. The sound of the stoneware settling onto the wooden plank was a small, definitive sound in the quiet room. It was the sound of an anchor being dropped, the sound of a journey ending and a life beginning. She stood there for a long moment, her hand still resting on the crock, and he saw her shoulders, for the first time, truly relax. It was as if in setting down that one small piece of her past, she was finally setting down the weight of her own solitary endurance. She was home. From that day, the cabin became a home. While Thomas worked the ranch, Nora worked a different kind of magic. She scrubbed the small cabin until it shone, her quiet, tireless energy transforming the dusty space. The air soon filled with the scent of baking bread from her mother's starter, a warm, yeasty smell that greeted Thomas every evening and seemed to seep into the very walls, making them strong. Their life fell into a rhythm, as natural and steady as the changing seasons. He would rise before dawn and find coffee hot on the stove and a parcel of food for his day. He would work until dusk, and when he returned, tired and cold, the cabin would be a beacon of warmth and light, a hot meal waiting on the table. They did not speak much at first. Their conversations were practical, about the weather or supplies needed from town or the progress on the fence line. But the silence between them was no longer awkward or strained. It was a comfortable, shared quiet, filled with unspoken understanding. It was the quiet of two people who knew each other's worth without needing to state it. He would sit at the small table she had scrubbed clean and eat the food she had prepared, and he would watch her. He watched the way the firelight caught the stray wisps of her hair, the efficient grace of her movements as she worked, the small, secret smiles that would sometimes touch her lips when she kneaded dough or stirred a pot. And she watched him. She saw the way he always left his muddy boots by the door, the quiet consideration in the gesture. She saw the strength in his hands when he mended a broken chair for her, and the gentleness in them when he petted the stray dog that had taken up residence on their porch. She saw a deep and abiding kindness in him, a steadfastness that she had never known. One evening, he came home to find she had used a bit of her first week's wages to buy new curtains for the window. They were simple, made of checked cotton, but they transformed the room, making it feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a permanent haven. He stood in the doorway, looking at them. "They're nice," he said. "I thought it needed a bit of color," she replied, her back to him as she stood at the stove. It was a simple exchange, but it was a milestone. It was the first time they had spoken of the cabin as a shared space, a place they were building together. The spring thaw came, and with it a change. The world outside turned from white to green. The air grew soft and smelled of damp earth and new life, and the quiet space between Thomas and Nora began to fill with words. He started telling her about his day, about a stubborn calf or a patch of good grazing he had found. She, in turn, began to share small pieces of her past, stories of her mother and father, of learning to cook at her mother's side. She told him the story of the stew, how it was her mother's recipe, a thing she made only when she was feeling most alone, a way to feel close to her family again. "I hadn't made it in a long time," she confessed one evening, her voice soft. Before that night, he knew which night she meant, the night he had first come to the way station. "I'm glad you did," he said. Their courtship was as unconventional as its beginning. It took place not in Sunday parlors or on chaperoned walks, but over shared chores and quiet evening meals. It was a courtship of mended fences and freshly baked bread, of mutual respect growing slowly and surely into something deeper. The decision to marry was not made in a moment of grand passion. It was a slow, dawning realization, a logical and inevitable conclusion to the life they were already living. He asked her one evening in early summer. They were sitting on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. The dog was asleep at his feet. The air was warm and smelled of pine. "Nora," he began, his voice a little rough. He cleared his throat. "This arrangement, it works." She looked at him, her hands still in her lap. "Yes," she said, "it does." I was thinking, he went on, his gaze fixed on the horizon, that I would like to make it permanent. I would like for you to be my wife. He finally turned to look at her. I would like to stay, Nora. As your husband. It was a plain-spoken declaration, honest and direct, just like him. It was not filled with poetry, but it was filled with truth. Nora looked at him, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face, reaching her eyes and making them shine. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated happiness, a smile he had never seen before, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. Yes, Thomas, she said. I would like that very much. Then she added, with a hint of the gentle humor he was just beginning to discover in her, it took you long enough to ask. They were married a week later by the Justice of the Peace in Stonecreek. She wore a simple blue dress she had made herself. He wore his cleanest shirt. Peters from the Anchor stood as his witness. There was no fanfare, no celebration, just a quiet ceremony and the signing of a paper that made official what their hearts already knew. When they returned to the cabin, it was no longer his cabin where she worked. It was their home. 7 years later, Thomas Greer sat on that same porch, now wider and shaded by a proper roof. The rocking chair he sat in was worn smooth from use. Beside him, in a matching chair, sat Nora. Her hair had a few strands of silver in it now, and the lines around her eyes spoke of laughter more than weariness. The small cabin was still there, but it was now connected to a larger, sturdier house that Thomas had built with his own hands, room by room, as their family grew. The small homestead was now a thriving ranch, the Anchor brand having been absorbed into their own. A boy of 6 with his father's quiet nature and steady gaze was carefully stacking blocks on the porch steps. A girl of 4 with her mother's bright, observant eyes and a dusting of freckles was chasing fireflies in the twilight, her laughter like tiny bells in the warm evening air. Nora was mending one of the boys' shirts, her hands moving with the same familiar, efficient grace. She looked up and saw Thomas watching her, a fond, settled look on his face. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "That stew," he said, his voice a low rumble. She smiled, a knowing, private smile. "Still thinking about that stew after all this time?" "Always," he said. "It's the stew that started it all." She put her mending aside and reached over to place her hand on his. Her hand was no longer cold. It was warm and capable and fit perfectly in his. "No, Thomas," she said softly. "You did. You saw me when no one else was looking." He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. He looked out at their land, at their children, at the life they had built from nothing more than a bowl of stew and a plain-spoken promise. He was not a man of many words, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that every step of his long, aimless journey had been leading him here. To her, to this porch, to this quiet, perfect moment. He had been a drifter looking for a place to winter. He had found a place to live, a reason to stay, and a love as warm and nourishing as the meal that had first shown him the way home.